What we'll cover today in this session is a little bit of a deep dive into the concept of incremental revenue measurement. There's a fair bit of nuance around it, so a few things to cover today, ranging from different methods and specific instances where incrementality can be a fairly confusing concept, and we just need to be very clear in the way we measure it and interpret it. We'll start with some basic principles. This context really is, you've sent out a campaign to a target base. So you've got a set of customers that you sent the campaign out to. You usually would do the measurement on, the delivered base where you actually were able to confirm that a message was received by the customer, not the full outreach base. That's normally what one would do if one is able to get the delivery reports. There's a control group that gets held out from the target base. This is, most commonly a 5 or a 10% group. It's a random sample, stratified sample to make sure there's representation across the kinds of segments within the target base. And a control group very often needs to be held out for a period of time. If you hold it out fresh for each campaign, you're not really going to be able to measure the impact of having done targeted communication. At the same time, you can't hold it out for too long. And, I've seen once in a while people extract the CG from a non-deliverable or a DND or a opt-out kind of a base. That's a biased sample, so not a great idea. You just get weird outcomes from holding a base out from the non-delivery base. So anyway, you've sent a campaign to a TG base, you got a control group held out, and you have a concept of a response window. So from that base of people you targeted, all of those who do a transaction within the next n days or what would the time window be, that's treated as a conversion, that transaction is linked to that campaign. If you've done multiple campaigns in a short window, last touch kind of works okay. You can go multi-touch, but last touch would be, a fairly okay way to figure out what conversions to tag to which campaign. So that's your basic principles. You got a TG, you got a CG, you got a response window, and all purchases happening by the TG within the response window are tagged as conversions. Now let's get to the actual measurement of incremental revenue. So here's an example. You got a target group of 180,000 odd customers. You got a control group of about 12,000 customers. The conversions within the response window we just spoke of in the TG and the CG, and the conversion percentage works out to 1.07 and 0.8. Now the CG conversion percentage, one would theorize that this is that baseline conversion that would have happened anyway, because the CG is exposed equally to anything you've done on social media, anything you've done above the line, macro factors, competition. So anything else that's happening because of your marketing efforts or because of external factors is captured by the CG. So, you may be having a big festive sale happening, but that's going to affect the CG equally, is the theory. So the 0.8 kind of represents what would have happened anyway. The 1.07 kind of gives you an indication that there's been some uplift in the conversion percentage. And the way you measure incrementality is you say, had this target base of customers behaved like the CG at a 0.8%, we would have got 1,400 conversions as against the 1,900 that we ended up getting. So you do have extra conversions that have happened. So this is the crux of it. Had the TG base behaved like the CG base, we would have gotten so many conversions, but we ended up getting these many conversions, which means that the difference between these two is incremental conversions. Once you've arrived at incremental conversions, you can apply the average bill value and you end up with incremental revenue. Just one thing I'd like to point out over here is this 499 incremental conversions. It's kind of a mathematical number. You can't go back into your database and isolate which of my bills are these 499 incremental bills. That's not possible. You just get a number that it's 499 bills that are incremental, but you cannot isolate which ones are the incremental bills. This is how incremental revenue is computed. Now, the additional thing that one has to keep in mind is it's not always going to be as neat. When you're doing a number of campaigns, like let's say there's multiple triggers happening, this first trigger is the same thing that we just saw, but there could be instances where you send out a trigger or a campaign and the control group has a higher percentage conversion for some reason than your target group. So the notion of a successful trigger is if the CG percentage conversion is higher than the TG percentage conversion, that's an unsuccessful trigger, and you set the incremental revenue for that trigger to 0. And this really comes from a place that by sending out the campaign, you're not like actively dissuading customers from coming to you, so you can't have a negative incremental revenue. If the trigger has not worked, that's zero incrementality, is the thinking behind this way of looking at incremental revenue. So what you end up with is, if you have multiple triggers, there's some triggers that are successful, which means TG is greater than CG. There's some triggers that are unsuccessful, and for those triggers, you set the incremental revenue as 0. For the others, you kind of carry on with the same computation that we showed in the previous slide. Now let's get to the methods of, aggregating this up over a time period. Because, let's say you want to look at how successful was my, initiative over the month. So when you look at that month level aggregation, there are two very distinct ways of doing it, especially when you have triggers that are fired every single day. Now, these are life cycle triggers typically. So you have some triggers, for example, something that's going out on the 7th day of a new customer's acquisition. That's going to get fired every single day of the month. The trigger cross month measurement basically says daily recurring triggers. We are going to check their incremental revenue after first adding up the total base and the responses at the month level. So you do this addition first, and then you look at what's the difference between, TG and CG conversion percentage, and hence what's the number of incremental bills and incremental revenue. So you first add up 73,000 TG base, 3,000 CG base, and you do the entire computation for this line. You don't bother about what it looks like for day level, trigger outreach and conversion. This is usually the most common way it's done. And the reason you kind of do this is sometimes, saying that we're going to compute the impact of a trigger that's going every day at the day level just becomes too granular, and you end up with a very tiny control base and a target base. So the numbers kind of look a bit weird out there. So this is the trigger cross month level measurement, where you first add up and then compute incrementality. The alternate way is trigger cross day, where you first compute incrementality at a day level and then you add it up for the day. So, across all days for that trigger. So you first do this every single row of computation. Some days will have positive numbers, some days will be failed trigger days where CG did better than TG, and those will be set to 0, and you add it up. So it's the same set of triggers, but if you now look at it, here the measurement is coming out to $9,409. Out here it was 3,006. It just will be different. Trigger cross day is going to get you a higher incremental number. That's two very distinct ways of doing it. If I were to pick one, most of the time I would pick trigger cross month. The additional nuance is, in everything that we've seen so far, when you get to computing the revenue, you just multiply the number of incremental bills with the average bill value of the target group. But there is sometimes reason to believe that the average bill value has also been elevated or bumped up as compared to the control group average bill value because of the campaign. Now, our default thinking really is your campaigns and triggers are there to get the footfall into the store or get the person to your app or web page. the actual amount or the value of the conversion is honestly a function of available merchandise, the store staff, the kind of, experience in the store. So one shouldn't bother about this uplift. But sometimes you're doing campaigns specifically to drive this uplift, where you're saying that, buy above a certain value and we'll give you this offer. So it's possible that you're doing a lot of that, in which case you want to factor in, I'm driving higher bill values as well. So it's a variant of the same thing, where you'd essentially say, okay, we got extra bills, but we also got an uplift in value. So you also factor that in when you're saying, had the TG behaved as CG, I would take CG conversion percentage and CG value. What has TG actually done? You take TG conversion percentage and TG average bill value. The difference of the two will give you incremental revenue. So it's just a slightly different way of looking at incrementality, where you now looked at a lift in conversion and hence number of bills, as well as average bill value. An important thing to point out here is incremental revenue can get confusing and confounding at times when you say that, across a trigger, I got a certain incremental revenue, but I now want to see how this incremental revenue by segment within that trigger. So let's say you sent out this trigger and the population or the target base that you had for this trigger included two distinct segments, like maybe two different geographies or two different loyalty tiers or just two different CLM segments or RFM based segments. Now, you would assume that when I look at incrementality at the segment level, and the segment is a subset of this trigger, it should add up to the same incremental revenue, but it will not necessarily do so. And here's why. This is that same trigger that we saw earlier, customers and conversions and percentage conversion and incrementality. If this was split out into two segments, and the split is post facto, you finished the trigger, you've done the campaign, now you're analyzing the results and saying, these 183,000, I had two segments, this exactly adds up, 64,000 and 119,000. Even the CG is exactly split into these two. The number of conversions is exactly the same. It's the same 1972 split out into what I got from segment 1 and segment 2. But what can happen is, for one of the segments, my CG conversion percentage is higher than TG. For the other segment, TG is higher than CG. So this becomes successful, this becomes unsuccessful. I just end up with a different incremental revenue number. So you've got the same number of people targeted, which is the addition of segment 1, segment 2. You've got the same number of conversions. You just don't end up with the same number of incremental conversions and the incremental revenue. So, essentially this means that you have to take a stance on what is your level of granularity when it comes to measuring incrementality. And then you got to pretty much stick to that. If you do a roll up or you do a further deep dive and split it out or a drill down, you're not necessarily going to find numbers that add up to that stance that you took, that we are going to measure at the trigger cross month level, for example. So this can get confusing. It's just good to know that this is a normal phenomenon. And this could, by the way, swing in either direction. When you break it out into segments, very often you could just end up with a larger number than what you saw over here when you sum up across triggers across the month. So, you could just end up with different numbers in any direction. A final and completely different way of looking at incrementality is actually nothing to do with campaigns. This is to do with across a CRM KPI, like new to repeat. NTR is new to repeat. I got new customers in the year. How many of them am I able to get to do a second transaction? You could have a control group of new customers. So I had 250,000 new customers in the year. I had a control group of 10,000 new customers that I did not target for campaigns through the year. So this requires a long-term control group. And if I had a new to repeat percentage of 22% for my base and 20% for my control, I can use this information to also arrive at this meant so many more customers and so many more bills, and at the average bill value, so much more revenue. So it's a completely different way of looking at incrementality, nothing to do with campaigns, but CRM KPIs. I don't think one needs to choose between one and the other. They give you very different pictures. So it's just a healthy thing to have both in play. Campaign incrementality will really help you optimize campaigns. KPI level incrementality will help you optimize, larger, higher order missions. In summary, you can measure at a campaign level using a TG versus CG mechanism. You can, for recurring triggers, you could have trigger cross month or trigger cross day level ways of looking at it. You could introduce measurements which also look at lift in the average bill value. And you can add on an alternate or additional method, which is just that uplift in CRM KPIs, which is also a TG versus CG mechanism, to kind of triangulate on what's the impact that is being computed. And that watch out over there, it's an important one. If you kind of split out triggers into different levels of granularity by segment or by channel or by region, etc., you can compute incremental numbers, but they're not going to add up. So it does get confusing the moment you start rolling up or drilling down. That's all we had for this session. Thank you.